Death, as it turns out, comes in many flavors across the galaxy. The Zephyrians prefer their mortality served with a side of plasma incineration. The Kraknari enjoy the classic approach of being devoured alive by their own offspring. But the inhabitants of Keth 9 had apparently decided that subtlety was overrated when it came to evolutionary design. The planet itself looked innocent enough from orbit, a swirling mass of purple and gold that resembled a particularly aggressive bruise, standard atmospheric readings, adequate gravity, the usual cocktail of gases that supported carbon-based life forms. Nothing in the preliminary scans suggested that Keth 9 housed what would eventually be classified as threat level Omega Prime, a designation so rarely used that most xenobiologists assumed it was a clerical error. The Intergalactic Species Classification Bureau, that monument to bureaucratic efficiency that somehow managed to catalogue every sentient sneeze across 17 systems, had developed a rather straightforward approach to dangerous creatures. Level Alpha meant mildly inconvenient, the sort of thing that might steal your lunch money if you weren't paying attention. Level Beta suggested moderately concerning, creatures that required actual weapons to dispatch. Level Gamma indicated seriously problematic, the kind of beasts that made seasoned hunters reach for their lucky charms and update their wills. Omega Prime, however, was reserved for creatures so fundamentally hostile to continued existence that the Bureau's official recommendation was maintain a minimum distance of 3 star systems and pray to whatever deity accepts your particular brand of cosmic insurance. The first expedition to encounter what would later be designated as the Vortarch consisted of a Valdorian research vessel staffed by beings whose evolutionary ancestors had clawed their way to the top of their own food chain through a combination of superior intellect and an impressive array of natural weaponry. The Valdorians had faced down crystal-eating parasites on Nexus Prime, survived the psychic predators of the Void Reaches, and once famously defeated an entire swarm of carnivorous nebulae using nothing but tactical superiority and an unhealthy amount of caffeine. They lasted approximately 14 minutes on Keth 9. The expedition logs, retrieved from the automated beacon that ejected itself from the ship's hull during what the vessel's AI diplomatically termed a rapid unscheduled disassembly event, made for fascinating reading. The initial entries described standard xenobiological procedures: atmospheric analysis, terrain mapping, preliminary scans for indigenous life forms, standard operating procedure for indigenous life forms, then came entry timestamp 0:14 and 7 seconds. Large predator detected, estimate 12 meters in length, approaching to investigate. Entry timestamp 0:14 and 23 seconds. Correction, predator is significantly larger than initial assessment, attempting to maintain safe distance. Entry timestamp 0:14 and 31 seconds. Sweet merciful void, it's not stopping. The final entry, timestamp 0:14 and 42 seconds, consisted entirely of what xenolinguists would later classify as advanced creative profanity in 7 languages, followed by sounds consistent with expensive scientific equipment being repurposed as abstract art. The Vortarch, as reconstructed from the scattered remains of sensor data and the occasional blurred image captured by fleeing reconnaissance drones, defied most known principles of biological engineering. Standing roughly 20 meters at the shoulder when fully extended, the creature possessed 6 limbs, arranged in a configuration that suggested evolution had been experimenting with recreational pharmaceuticals. Its hide appeared to be composed of some sort of adaptive armor plating that shifted between transparent and opaque depending on environmental conditions, making it simultaneously invisible and blindingly obvious. The head, if the term could be applied to something that seemed to have been designed by a committee of nightmares, featured not 1 but 3 distinct jaw structures, each capable of independent operation. The primary jaw handled the initial procurement of food. The secondary jaw managed the more delicate work of separating useful nutrients from inconvenient items like bones, armor plating, and the occasional starship hull. The tertiary jaw, according to the fragmentary biological data recovered from various expeditions, appeared to exist purely for the sake of making absolutely certain that whatever the Vortarch was eating stayed properly dead. Its sensory apparatus consisted of a dozen eyes arranged in a pattern that provided complete spherical vision, each eye capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation across a spectrum that ranged from standard visible light to frequencies that most species couldn't perceive without specialized equipment. The creature's auditory sensors could reportedly detect heartbeats from distances measured in kilometers, while its olfactory capabilities allowed it to track chemical signatures across planetary distances. The Vorthak's hunting strategy displayed a level of sophistication that bordered on the insulting. Rather than simply charging at prey with the subtle approach of a natural disaster, the creature employed tactics that suggested it had not only studied advanced military strategy, but had probably earned advanced degrees in the subject. It would spend days stalking potential targets, learning their behavioral patterns, identifying their weaknesses, and generally conducting the sort of thorough reconnaissance that most armies would envy. When the Vorthak finally struck, it did so with the precision of a surgical laser and the enthusiasm of a particularly aggressive avalanche. The creature could move with surprising stealth for something the size of a small building, appearing without warning and disappearing just as quickly once it had concluded its business. Survivors, on the rare occasions when there were any, reported that the Vorthak seemed to take genuine pleasure in the hunt, displaying what could only be described as a sense of humor about the entire process. The second expedition, mounted by the hegemony of rational thought, approached the Vorthak problem with the sort of methodical planning that had allowed their species to survive 3 separate attempts at galactic conquest. They arrived at Keth 9 with enough firepower to sterilize a small moon, protective equipment that could withstand direct hits from antimatter weapons, and a battle plan that had been refined through 17 different simulation runs. The Vorthak killed them all in under 6 minutes, apparently taking time to examine their equipment with what the expedition's final transmission described as professional curiosity. The third expedition tried a different approach entirely. The Collective of Harmonious Existence, a species that had achieved interstellar travel through a combination of advanced technology and aggressive pacifism, decided that the Vorthak simply needed to be understood rather than fought. They arrived with gifts, cultural exchange protocols, and an impressive array of translation equipment designed to facilitate communication with even the most alien intelligence. The Vorthak ate the translation equipment first, presumably to avoid any uncomfortable conversations about its dietary preferences. By the time the 7th expedition failed to return, the Intergalactic Species Classification Bureau had elevated the Vorthak to Omega Prime status and issued a formal recommendation that Keth 9 be designated as a quarantine zone. The planet was marked with warning beacons, surrounded by automated defense platforms programmed to turn away any vessel that approached within scanning range, and generally treated as a cosmic hazard on par with unstable wormholes and tax audits. The scientific community, however, remained fascinated by the Vorthak's apparent invincibility. Xenobiologists across the galaxy published papers on the creature's impossible physiology. Military strategists analyzed its hunting patterns for potential tactical applications, and philosophers debated the existential implications of a predator so perfectly adapted to its environment that it appeared to transcend the normal limitations of biological evolution. It was during one such philosophical debate, broadcast across the academic networks that connected research institutions throughout the galaxy, that the news of the Vorthak reached Earth. The transmission, picked up by a communications array that had been installed primarily to monitor interstellar weather patterns, contained detailed biological data, tactical assessments, and a comprehensive analysis of why the Vorthak represented the ultimate expression of predatory evolution. The Human Xenobiology Department, a modest research facility that operated on a budget roughly equivalent to what most alien civilizations spent on office supplies, received the transmission during what was officially designated as Tuesday afternoon. The department's response to learning about the galaxy's most dangerous predator was, in hindsight, remarkably predictable. They immediately began planning an expedition to go meet it. The human response to discovering the galaxy's most efficient killing machine was, by any reasonable standard, completely insane. Where other species had responded with military expeditions, advanced weaponry, or philosophical treatises on the nature of death, humanity's Xenobiology Department held a staff meeting and decided that what the situation really needed was a closer look. The decision-making process, as documented in the department's official records, displayed the sort of bureaucratic logic that had somehow allowed humans to survive their own technological adolescence. The initial proposal, submitted in triplicate and filed under probably inadvisable research initiatives, suggested that the Vorthak represented an unprecedented opportunity to study apex predator behavior in an uncontrolled environment. The department head, a woman whose previous research had focused on the mating habits of Martian algae, approved the expedition with the sort of casual indifference typically reserved for office supply requests. Her official statement, preserved for posterity in the department's archives, read, "Well, it's not like we're doing anything important this quarter anyway." The expedition team consisted of 3 researchers, a graduate student whose thesis advisor had apparently developed a peculiar sense of humor and enough scientific equipment to stock a small laboratory. The mission parameters were refreshingly straightforward: travel to Keth 9, observe the Vorthak in its natural habitat, collect behavioral data, and try not to become part of the local food chain. The transportation was provided by the Merchant Guild, an organization that had built its reputation on being willing to transport anything, anywhere, for the right price. The Guild's representative, a being whose species had evolved from what could charitably be described as aggressive furniture, expressed genuine confusion about humanity's interest in studying something that had already demonstrated its ability to convert research teams into abstract art. The vessel assigned to the mission was the trading ship Profit Margin, a craft that had seen better decades and whose captain maintained a strict policy of not asking questions about cargo as long as the payment cleared. The ship's crew consisted of various species who had either fallen on hard times or possessed a particularly flexible relationship with conventional safety protocols. The journey to Keth 9 took 17 standard days, during which the human research team conducted what they called preliminary behavioral studies and what the crew referred to as sitting around asking weird questions about everything. The lead researcher, a specialist in xenobiology whose previous work had involved cataloging the social structures of hive-minded crystalline entities, spent most of the voyage reviewing the expedition reports from previous missions. Her analysis of the data revealed a pattern that had apparently escaped the notice of every other scientific team that had studied the Vorthak. While previous expeditions had focused on the creature's physical capabilities, hunting efficiency and tactical sophistication, they had largely ignored what she termed environmental integration factors. The Vorthak wasn't simply a predator that happened to live on Keth 9. It was a predator that had evolved specifically to thrive in that particular ecosystem. The distinction was subtle but significant. Most apex predators were generalists, capable of adapting to various environments and prey species. The Vorthak appeared to be something else entirely, a specialist so perfectly adapted to its environment that it had essentially become part of the planet's ecological infrastructure. The creature didn't just hunt on Keth 9, it actively maintained the planet's biological balance through selective predation. This observation led to what the research team's official log described as an interesting hypothesis regarding interspecies communication protocols. Previous expeditions had approached the Vorthak as a hostile entity to be studied, contained, or eliminated. None had considered the possibility that the creature might be operating according to its own complex social and territorial behaviors. The Profit Margin reached Keth 9 without incident, largely because the ship's captain had developed a healthy respect for automated warning systems and maintained a safe distance from the quarantine zone. The human research team transferred to a smaller shuttle, equipped with basic life support and enough sensor equipment to monitor local environmental conditions. The descent to Keth 9's surface proceeded smoothly until the shuttle's proximity alarms began detecting what the navigational computer diplomatically termed large mobile objects in the immediate vicinity. The shuttle's sensors, designed primarily for atmospheric navigation rather than biological survey work, could only provide rough estimates of the object's size and movement patterns. The objects, as it turned out, were Vorthak. 3 of them, moving through the planet's dense vegetation with the sort of coordinated precision that suggested either advanced intelligence or a level of instinctual cooperation that bordered on telepathy. The creatures maintained a consistent distance from the shuttle, neither approaching nor retreating, simply observing. The research team's response to finding themselves under observation by 3 specimens of the galaxy's most dangerous predator was characteristically human. They began taking notes. The lead researcher established a monitoring station approximately 50 meters from the shuttle's landing site, well within the theoretical safety range of the vessel's defensive systems, but close enough to conduct meaningful observation. The other team members began deploying sensor equipment designed to monitor everything from electromagnetic signatures to chemical traces in the local atmosphere. The Vorthak, for their part, appeared to find this behavior fascinating. Rather than attacking the intruders or retreating to avoid potential threats, the creatures settled into what could only be described as observation positions. They remained motionless for hours at a time, their multiple eyes tracking the humans' movements with the sort of patient attention typically associated with professional researchers. The first day of observation yielded data that contradicted virtually every assumption made by previous expeditions. The Vorthak demonstrated none of the aggressive territorial behavior reported in earlier studies. They showed no interest in testing the humans' defensive capabilities. They displayed no signs of the predatory stalking patterns that had been documented in other encounters. Instead, the creatures appeared to be conducting their own study of the human research team. They observed the humans' daily routines, monitored their interaction patterns, and seemed particularly interested in the team's scientific equipment. On several occasions, individual Vorthak approached the monitoring station during periods when the humans were absent, examining the sensor arrays with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. The research team's daily reports, transmitted back to Earth via the communication relay maintained by the Profit Margin, documented a series of increasingly unprecedented observations. The Vorthak exhibited complex social behaviors, including what appeared to be a sophisticated communication system based on combinations of subsonic vocalizations and electromagnetic field modulation. They demonstrated advanced problem-solving capabilities, using tools fashioned from local materials to manipulate their environment in ways that suggested both intelligence and creativity. Most significantly, the creatures appeared to be attempting to communicate with the human observers. The lead researcher noted that the Vorthak had begun modifying their behavior in response to the humans' presence, adopting movement patterns and positioning strategies that seemed designed to facilitate observation and data collection. By the end of the first week, the research team had documented enough behavioral data to fundamentally challenge the existing scientific understanding of the Vorthak. The creatures weren't simply efficient killing machines. They were intelligent beings, operating according to complex social and environmental protocols that previous expeditions had never bothered to investigate. The breakthrough came during the second week, when the lead researcher made a decision that would have horrified the safety committees of every major research institution in the galaxy. She decided to attempt direct contact with one of the Vorthak specimens. The attempt began with what the research team's official log described as basic, non-threatening communication protocols. The researcher approached the perimeter of the creature's observation area, moving slowly and maintaining what she hoped were universal indicators of peaceful intent. She carried no weapons, wore no protective armor, and made no sudden movements that might be interpreted as aggressive behavior. The Vorthak's response was immediate and completely unexpected. Rather than attacking, retreating, or displaying any of the behaviors documented in previous encounters, the creature approached the human researcher with what could only be described as curiosity. It moved slowly, deliberately, maintaining a distance that allowed for mutual observation while avoiding any actions that might be perceived as threatening. The first direct contact between human and Vorthak lasted approximately 30 seconds. No communication was exchanged, no dramatic revelations occurred. The researcher and the creature simply observed each other, each apparently trying to understand what they were seeing. But in those 30 seconds, something fundamental changed. The Vorthak's posture shifted from the alert readiness of a predator to something closer to the relaxed attention of a fellow researcher. Its multiple eyes focused on the human with an intensity that suggested not hunger, but genuine interest. When the researcher slowly extended her hand, palm open and empty, the Vorthak responded by lowering its massive head until it was level with the human's position. The creature's primary sensory organs, clustered around what might generously be called its face, oriented toward the researcher with an almost delicate precision. The moment stretched, pregnant with possibilities that neither species had previously imagined. And then, with a movement so subtle that the monitoring equipment almost missed it, the apex predator of Keth 9 gently touched its forehead to the human's outstretched hand. The contact between human and Vorthak lasted exactly 3.7 seconds, according to the sensor readings that would later be analyzed by xenobiologists across 17 star systems. During those 3.7 seconds, Every fundamental assumption about apex predator behavior, interspecies communication, and the nature of evolutionary dominance was quietly discarded and replaced with something that defied classification. The researchers' first reaction was to remain perfectly still, a response that demonstrated either exceptional scientific discipline or the sort of paralysis that occurs when one's nervous system receives contradictory signals about whether to run or document the experience. The Vorthak's reaction was equally measured, maintaining the gentle contact while its other sensory organs conducted what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of everything from the human's biochemical signature to her emotional state. When the creature finally withdrew, it did so with the same deliberate care it had shown in approaching. The other members of the research team responded with the sort of academic excitement typically reserved for discovering new mathematical theorems. The graduate students' reaction consisted primarily of creative expressions of disbelief, interspersed with rapid-fire questions about sensor calibration. The lead researcher had begun to formulate a hypothesis that would have been dismissed as fantasy by any reasonable scientific review board. The Vorthak's behavior suggested not just intelligence, but a form of social cognition that operated on principles entirely different from those documented in other apex predators. Over the following days, the research team established what they tentatively classified as structured interaction protocols with the 3 Vorthak specimens. The creatures demonstrated inexhaustible patience for human observation techniques, allowing close-range studies of their physiology and behavior patterns. The data revealed sophistication that challenged basic assumptions about predator evolution. The Vorthak exhibited cultural behaviors, including ritualized greeting ceremonies and complex social hierarchies. Most remarkably, they began modifying their behavior to facilitate the humans' research activities, positioning themselves for optimal sensor readings and even demonstrating specific behaviors upon request. The breakthrough came when the lead researcher began attempting to communicate through physical gestures and positioning rather than relying entirely on technological mediation. The Vorthak's response was immediate and enthusiastic. The creatures began mirroring the researcher's gestures, elaborating on them, and introducing variations that suggested active participation in developing a shared communication protocol. Within hours, they had established a basic vocabulary of positions and movements that allowed for simple information exchange. The galaxy's most feared predator was actively collaborating with a species it had never encountered, demonstrating cognitive flexibility that exceeded anything previously documented in apex predator behavior. The research team's daily reports began to read like science fiction rather than conventional xenobiological documentation. The Vorthak demonstrated advanced problem-solving capabilities and individual personalities. Most significantly, they appeared to possess what could only be described as a sense of humor. During the 3rd week, additional Vorthak began arriving at the research site. By week's end, 7 creatures had gathered, each eager to participate in the interspecies cultural exchange. The crew of the Profit Margin expressed increasing concern about the growing congregation of apex predators, but the research team had begun to understand something previous expeditions had missed entirely. The Vorthak weren't gathering because they perceived the humans as threats or prey. They were gathering because they were genuinely interested in the visitors from another world. The creatures displayed behavior patterns consistent with scientific curiosity, social engagement, and friendship. The revelation came when the lead researcher attempted to document the full extent of the Vorthak's social structure. Using the established communication protocol, she began requesting demonstrations of the creature's natural behaviors, hoping to observe their hunting techniques, territorial displays, and hierarchical interactions. The Vorthak's response was to ignore the request entirely. Instead, they began demonstrating behaviors that had never been documented in any previous study. They showed the researcher how they cultivated certain plant species for medicinal purposes. They demonstrated construction techniques used to create shelters that were nearly invisible to conventional sensors. They revealed a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, using ground-based markers to track celestial movements with remarkable precision. The creatures weren't simply apex predators. They were gardeners, engineers, and astronomers. They were a civilization that had chosen to live in harmony with their environment rather than dominating it through technological superiority. The aggressive behavior documented by previous expeditions wasn't evidence of mindless predatory instinct. It was a defensive response to perceived threats to their carefully maintained ecological balance. The most significant revelation came when the researcher attempted to understand why the Vorthak had responded so differently to human contact than to previous expeditions. Using the established communication protocol, she managed to convey the concept of other visitors, other species, that had come to Keth 9 before the humans arrived. The Vorthak's response was immediate and illuminating. They demonstrated clear recognition of the previous expeditions, using gesture and positioning to convey their understanding of the other species' motivations and behaviors. The creatures had perceived the earlier visitors as threats, not because of their physical capabilities, but because of their intentions. Every previous expedition had approached Keth 9 with the goal of studying, containing, or eliminating the Vorthak. The creatures had responded accordingly. The humans, however, had approached with genuine curiosity and respect for the Vorthak as intelligent beings rather than dangerous animals. The creatures had recognized this fundamental difference and responded with corresponding openness and cooperation. The moment of ultimate revelation came when the largest of the Vorthak specimens approached the lead researcher during what had become their daily communication session. The creature moved with ceremonial precision, adopting a formal posture that the researcher had learnt to recognize as indicating significant social meaning. With elaborate care, the massive predator lowered itself until its head was level with the human's position. Then, in a gesture that would have been impossible for any previous expedition to achieve, the apex predator of Keth 9 pressed its forehead against the researcher's hand and held the position for several seconds. When the creature finally withdrew, every other Vorthak in the area had adopted similar postures of respect and acknowledgement. The galaxy's most feared predators had just formally recognized a human as their equal, their friend, and their welcome guest in their ancient civilization. The research team's final transmission of the day consisted of a single line: "We're going to need to revise the threat assessment." The footage from Keth 9 arrived at the Intergalactic Species Classification Bureau on what happened to be their annual Paperwork Appreciation Day, a bureaucratic holiday dedicated to celebrating the efficient processing of forms in triplicate. The timing was, in retrospect, rather appropriate for what would become the most significant administrative revision in galactic history. The initial response from the Bureau's review committee was predictably skeptical. The video showing a human researcher being formally acknowledged by 7 Vorthak specimens was examined for evidence of digital manipulation, creative editing, and what the committee's official report described as possible hallucinogenic interference with recording equipment. When the technical analysis confirmed the footage's authenticity, the committee moved to Phase 2 of their standard protocol: denial. Surely the humans had discovered some previously unknown subspecies of Vorthak, something smaller and less dangerous than the true apex predators documented by previous expeditions. The fact that the creatures in the footage were clearly identical to those described in early reports was dismissed as convergent evolutionary coincidence. Phase 3 involved calling in the experts: xenobiologists, behavioral specialists, and military strategists from across the galaxy reviewed the human expedition data with the sort of methodical thoroughness typically reserved for investigating insurance fraud. Their conclusions were unanimous and deeply disturbing to the established scientific order. The humans had achieved something that defied every known principle of apex-predator interaction. The revelation that the Vorthak were not mindless killing machines, but rather a sophisticated civilization, prompted what historians would later term the Great Taxonomic Panic of 2387. Species classification databases across 17 systems required comprehensive revision. Military threat assessments were rendered obsolete. The entire framework for understanding predator-prey relationships needed fundamental reconstruction. The philosophical implications proved even more challenging than the practical ones. If the galaxy's most feared predators were actually peaceful gardener astronomers who had been defending their civilization from perceived threats, what did that say about the assumptions underlying interspecies contact protocols? How many other dangerous species were simply misunderstood civilizations responding to poorly planned first contact attempts? The Human Xenobiology Department, meanwhile, received a budget increase that elevated them from modest research facility to well-funded intergalactic phenomenon. The lead researcher found herself fielding interview requests from academic institutions across the galaxy. all eager to understand how a species, barely capable of interstellar travel, had succeeded where advanced civilizations had failed. The answer, as documented in her subsequent papers, was embarrassingly simple. The humans had approached the Vorthak with genuine curiosity and respect, rather than fear or conquest. They had treated the creatures as potential equals, rather than subjects to be studied or threats to be eliminated. The Vorthak had responded accordingly. The irony was not lost on the galactic scientific community. The species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of warfare, the civilizations that had conquered star systems and bent entire worlds to their will, had been humbled by creatures who valued harmony over dominance. And it had taken the galaxy's newest and least technologically advanced species to recognize what everyone else had missed. The Vorthak, for their part, established formal diplomatic relations with Earth and began sharing their astronomical knowledge with human researchers. Their understanding of celestial mechanics, developed through millennia of observation, advanced human space navigation by several centuries practically overnight. The final entry in the expedition log, submitted after the research team's triumphant return to Earth, consisted of a single observation that would be quoted in xenobiology textbooks for generations. Turns out the strongest apex predator in the galaxy has excellent manners and a fascinating perspective on sustainable agriculture. Who knew? The universe, it seemed, still had a few lessons to teach about the nature of true strength.